sponsored by Into the AM. Discount link in the description. Kitbashing and customizing miniatures has to be one of the most rewarding activities in this hobby. You get to turn something that everyone has into a unique thing that you can call your own. And adding a few easy to pick up sculpting skills as well as the right tools to the mix will give you even better results that you can be proud of. I assembled this video collection to show you a few tricks and the tools that you will need, as well as give you a few ideas and inspiration so you can start customizing your own miniatures. And speaking about inspiration, one of my favorite things in this hobby is to tap into the creativity of other people, whether it's artworks or fan art, and to get inspired and just throw together some really cool mini that doesn't already exist in this form. And it doesn't matter how many parts I need, and if I need to do some sculpting, as long as the end result is something really unique. And we'll do something similar today. So in this video, I'll probably present to you
the Batman.
Enjoying both Space Marines and vampires in the Warhammer universes, Night Lords were always a Venn diagram overlap that tickled my fancy. The natural thing to do when creating some Space Marines in vampire cosplay is to use fantasy vampire parts. But because I have a problem with destroying expensive plastic toy soldiers to create even more expensive plastic toy soldiers, I decided to make a copy of the parts that I needed. Eventually, I still want to paint my Prince Deval because it's an awesome model. So I whipped out my trusty Oyumaru and created a mold of the parts I wanted to use. When doing this, you need to make sure that the thermoplast covers properly. So I made sure to press the sides into the piece I wanted to mold in order to retain all the detail. I also pressed in part of the shoulder armor because the bat face on it would come in handy as extra armor detail. One complaint that I hear a lot when people work with these types of press molds is that they are losing detail, and that is usually due to air being trapped when you press the clay in, or the clay not reaching into all the wrinkles because you simply can't apply enough even pressure to get the material into these fine details of the mold. So before I put the bulk of my epoxy clay into the mold, I make sure to fill these small parts. Then I just fill in the rest of the mold with a little spill over the sides just to make sure that everything gets copied over. The copied parts always come out perfect when you follow these steps. So a little extra patience during this part always pays off. I'm still using Primaris Marines from the Dark Imperium box, which this body also is coming from. I was a bit unsure how much I would have to cut away from the Marine chestplate. That's why I always go slow in these scenarios. It's simply more difficult to resculpt parts that you cut away than taking a bit of extra time and going slow when planning out the result. I realized the color of the Marine would fit right into the upper area of the Val's chestplate if I made the U-shape just a bit wider. And after cutting away anything that wasn't part of that skull on the main portion, it snuggled right in there. So I glued it in place and scraped away a few parts in the lower area so they would meet on the same level. Then I was looking for places to put my extra vampire elements, and the size of the shoulder armor was just about right after I cut away the extra features to fit on the knee pad of the Space Marine armor. I cut away the round part, and initially I thought I would keep the lower edge of the plate the bat face was sitting on to add an extra bit of gothic feeling. That didn't look good enough, it was just too large and didn't properly work. At that point I already cut away the line dividing the round part from the shin, so I had to resculpt that part, which was a bit of a pain. The helmet would have to be something really special. I was looking through my bits box, but I couldn't quite find a helmet with a skull face that would fit by maybe just adding some kind of bat wings. So I was looking online for printable parts, but I also couldn't find anything I liked. Honestly, if these were available as an STL file, I'd probably have bought them, but I didn't want to buy a pack of 5 where I only really liked 2 designs out of the 5 and had to pay shipping on top. At least the designs gave me a bit of a direction I wanted to go in. My very best investment ever was the Games Workshop skull box, and I picked one of these bloodletter skulls, which I thought would fit nicely. The idea was to cut away as little as possible from the helmet to fit the skull part in. As an example, I kept all the piping intact. Next I got rid of the top part of the helmet so I could do something similar to the designs from before. That would give me a more aggressive and dramatic result. So far so good, but here it got a bit tricky. The eye sockets were a bit too small to fit Space Marine lenses in, so I basically added just 0.5 millimeter of material onto the skull parts, bulking them up. This is a good exercise for learning how to sculpt, by the way. You are recreating a shape that already exists, just a bit bigger. I wanted to add sharp angles and lines to the final design, so first I had to build some additional volume. Starting with a long piece of clay in the middle of the helmet that would form an edge between left and right half. Then I added a similar part to the right and the left, where I would later carve my lines into. Again, I know this doesn't necessarily look like beginner stuff, but trust me, see it as an exercise. Just like you can learn brush control, this teaches you how to use your tool and how to work with the clay while applying the thin layers. I was filling in the area in between 2 rows of clay and then carefully carved a line on the side and refined it with the color shaper. A final pass with sandpaper after everything was cured makes sure that everything is sharp, clean and even. Thanks a lot to Into the AM for sponsoring this compendium video. Not only are they completely dominating my wardrobe, heck, I don't even remember the last time I was shopping anywhere else. Their continued support of this channel keeps the lights on, so let's show them some love, shall we? Into the AM is known for some of the most unique graphic t-shirts on the internet. I love their vivid colors and bold designs like these new arrivals or these bestsellers. But some of my all-time favorite t-shirts come from their vintage line. 100% cotton and a lot of these retro designs in a washed out look, giving me these sweet 80s vibes. And just a great comfortable feeling. It's almost like I'm wearing nothing. I had to double check. They also have top-notch basics, sportswear and everyday apparel, and the range just keeps growing constantly, making them a one-stop shop for innovative and stylish clothing. Lately they also added their new fall collections, adding flannel shirts and jackets. If you want to test their quality, you can check out these bundles that all come with a massive discount. Like the graphics tees 3-pack that is currently 50% off, and if you're using my link in the description, you can grab another 10% off while supporting this channel in the process. So if you want to look this stylish as well, use my link and head over there and grab one of the t-shirts or one of the new flannel shirts. And now let's get back to sculpting. Next I needed some wings for the helmet. There's a lot of bats in the Cursed City box, and where there's bats, there's bat wings. So just one of these swarms was pretty much setting me up for a couple of Night Lords and not just one. There's multiple sizes and I picked one that was appropriately sized for the helmet. These wings had a great structure and I just cleaned off the smallest finger and the area where the glue would go on, and then attached the wing with super glue. I guess sometimes the stars just align. I just filled that small gap on the side and the helmet was done. One box that's a pretty awesome fit for the project is this Screwed box. There's all kinds of gruesome parts in there, like flesh on hooks, halves of rib cages, and flayed skin with bones. I did end up not using the flesh bits, but flayed skin would fit as a loincloth.
Actually, the cloth you and many think is a loincloth is a half tabard. While a full tabard covers from shoulders down, the half is waist down.
Learn something new every day. And this would also be a good spot to fit this small bat head that I still had left over from Prince Duval's chest plate. To create some space for the bits, I got rid of the belt buckle and tried to find a good position for this part. It turned out to be a bit too wide, so I had to cut down the sides. And I'm inching my way forward here. Again, the more careful I am at this point, the less I have to resculpt later. And as you can see in the end, it fit right in there like it was meant to be. And the only thing left to sculpt was the part where the skin attached to the arm. I thought about leaving it attached to the chest plate like this, but then I decided to use the vampire belt buckle after all, like I initially planned, so I made a cut right under the belt, got rid of the part above, and carved away the more extreme folds because they didn't make sense in the context. I wanted something smoother that was just hanging. And doing it this way I could still keep the bones, even though we lost some of the skin parts. I plopped the belt buckle right on top of this and filled the surroundings up with some Milliput. In order not to make it look like just a few parts thrown together, I added skin parts wrapped over the belt and flaying out towards the sides. That way everything looks more integrated, and it's just a small time investment, but this will look more natural and credible when the miniature is base coated. I had a suspicion that the arms would need a bit of fiddling around, because I had a very particular pose in mind. And I went back to my Dark Imperium box and looked for a few arms with guns and also a sword arm. Once I found a good one, I needed to chaos it up though, because they weren't just standard Space Marine arms. So I got rid of the standard pauldron and added one from the old Chaos Space Marine spruce that I found in my bits box. It ended up looking a bit too flat and boring though, so I made one more copy of Count Duval's shoulder guard, and I started to carve into the Chaos pauldron. Once I had a big enough hole, I just slapped a portion of Milliput into the gap and pressed the demon bat face on. And I made sure that the curvature was similar to the original curve of the pauldron, so I had to cut away as little as possible. That way I only had to smooth out the areas around it and sand away the little bits still standing out afterwards. I didn't film that, but you get the idea. While the material was still soft, I added some detail so the face looked like it integrated with the pauldron, almost like a demon living inside. This would be a lot of fun to paint afterwards. When everything was done, I added back some of the typical chaos patterns to the trims. And I didn't really plan this, but there was just enough empty space to fit some of the smaller wings. For the sword arm, I needed just the right pose in order to make the weapon work. I found a good one in the easy to assemble Reapers pack. Problem was that it was holding a pistol, so I took that off with a clean cut and took another sword arm from the Dark Imperium box because I needed it for the armored hand. The archaic sword that I wanted to use because it would be fitting the theme better was coming from the Nighthorn's Bladegeist Remnants box and had a bare hand holding it, so I had to replace that. I drilled holes for the pins on everything I wanted to use and swapped the swords with clean cuts. Then I did some more pinning and gluing and eventually attached the arm. I glued the hand to the arm in a particular angle, as if he was commanding his brethren to charge the enemy. After dry fitting the helmet to check if the pose would work, I filled the gap and detailed the articulated parts. For the weapon in the other hand, I made this small bayonet from an old chaos knife from my bits box. Again, this arm was a standard marine arm, so I had to add something to make it fit the chaos theme better. And speaking about that, something that Games Workshop overdoes a bit in my opinion these days is these trims. They're plastered on the Chaos Space Marines and I almost want to scrape some of them off every time I paint one because it makes them look so overloaded. Here I have to do the exact opposite and break the monotonous and clean parts of the Space Marine armor up, and I added a few of these ornaments. I pressed on the rough shapes as thin as possible and then used a combination of color shaper and scalpels to push it in shape and carve clean edges. The last details I pushed in with a needle, especially if I wanted a really sharp corner, like here for example. Whenever the surface looked too flat, I pushed in a bit of texture with the tip of my color shape to create more variety. When I do this, I usually leave the clay to harden a bit before I start working. That way the Milliput isn't as flimsy and a bit more durable and easier to work with. It's always fun to experiment a bit with drying times and to see how the properties of your putty or clay change over time. The only thing left to do at this point was also the most important thing. I had to find a backpack that was large enough to hold the wings, but at the same time would not bulk the figure up too much, since I didn't want the wings to look too small to carry the body. I tried a couple of backpacks, but the one I settled on came from the Indominus box and belonged to one of the Eradicators. I cut away the exhausts and cleaned the sides so the wings would fit. The wings I used here were Dark Elder Scourge's wings. There's also a Daughters of Cain box that has more of these leathery wings, but they looked a bit too slender for my purpose. The base of the leathery parts was a bit too wide, so I marked the proper width that would work with the backpack with a scalpel and carved a credible curve. After I was happy with this, I did a bit of cleaning up, basically making the leathery parts a bit thinner again to be in line with the other membrane edges. Then I pinned the wings to the backpack and double checked if I was happy with the pose. I couldn't just leave it like this. I had to sell my idea that the wings grew inside and broke out of the backpack. So to blend it all together, I slapped some Milliput on the sides and pressed it flat. And then I had to come up with patterns that added to the idea I tried to convey. So I used a combination of needles and scalpels to create cracked and flaked elements of armor that were pushed aside by the wings. The backpack looked a bit too generic, so I decided to place another Night Lord symbol. I cut away the back of the head of one of the human skulls from the skull box so I could place it on the spherical feature on the backpack. Then I added a pair of small wings from the beds I still had left over. It was a quick thing to do, but I like it a lot. Then I just made sure to fill all the gaps that were left so it looked like everything was part of the sculpt. And here's the final result. I'm really happy with how it turned out and how the pose and all the individual parts work together. The gothic feeling of the sword, the wings on the helmet, and how the wings create a bit of a backdrop and frame the full figure. This is definitely something I want to paint eventually for a competition, because it's a really unique piece that will probably draw a lot of eyes. Let me know in the comments what you think, and also let me know which conversion you're interested in next. If you're curious about what it takes to get going with these type of conversions, find out all of the basics in this video, and I also have additional videos about sculpting for conversions on my Patreon. When doing conversions or kit bashing, sometimes having the right bits just isn't enough. And we need to blend together two elements by filling a gap, or we have to resculpt some features that got damaged when cutting the model apart. Or we don't have the right bits to begin with, and we have to create a cloak, maybe even some fur covering it, or maybe some loincloth. Because
in the grim darkness of the future, there's only loincloths.
So in this video, I'll do my best to show you the important basics of working with epoxy clay and to make your kit bashes and conversions even better than they already are. What's up, fellow pigment pushers? A while ago I showed my sword brother conversion on Instagram. For this conversion, I had to reposition the hand and had to cover the resulting gap with the typical sausage roll pattern. Bellows joints, that's what they're called? That Space Marines have covering their articulate parts. And ever since then, I've gotten a lot of requests to show how I work with epoxy clay. So let's start the clock and I'll turn you into a sculpting pro in just 3 minutes. Let's start with the tools that I'm using. Sets like these are a waste of time. They're too big, there's too many shapes, and not a single one of them is useful. If you haven't figured it out yet, this is a bit of a sore topic for me. Because when people ask me how to get better at sculpting, I tell them it all starts with the tools. And then I give them a whole spiel, and afterwards they just go,
Nah bruh, I have this tool, just show me how to sculpt with it.
and that's just not how sculpting works. You also don't paint detail on your 28mm minis with a tank brush. And even if you don't care how it looks, you just want to be fast.
I don't have all day.
When you have the proper tools, you'll just be as fast, possibly even faster, and your results are going to look so much better on top of that. I don't think I've owned any green stuff in the last 10 years, so I have to borrow some footage by other creators to illustrate my points. Here's Jazza using this tool, and sure, it creates volumes, but this is not the right tool to capture intricacies of muscles that integrate with each other. It's too big, it doesn't have the right shape, and it's too rigid. Again, I can hear people say, but it looks good enough. And yeah, okay, but if you had the right tool, it would look better with even less time investment. So why are companies selling you these tools as sculpting tools for miniatures? That's because they can't make money off of giving you the correct advice that a simple homemade tool will be more appropriate for the size. Again, remember this comparison. This is my sculpting workhorse. It's made from a brass rod filed into shape. If you're a hobbyist already, I'm sure you have one of these file sets at home. And if not, you can pick up a single small file like this for $2 at the do-it-yourself store. This tool is small enough and has a sharp edge, so I can cut through clay and carve it away if I need to. And I can create sharp edges. The other tool I use a lot is this color shaper. It's extra firm, size 0, and its shape is called angled chisel. It has both a round side I can use to flatten out clay and to spread clay on a surface, and it also has an edge that helps with getting inverted edges, as well as a nice tip for details, like I even use it to sculpt eyes on 28mm figures just because it's that small. Color shapers come in different shapes. This one, for example, helps with curves and so on. I suggest getting the angled chisel shape to start with. You can always get additional shapes later if you feel like you need them or if you want to experiment. The best thing about this tool is that it's not rigid but flexible, which means it conforms and adapts to shapes, which helps with applying clay on complex structures or while gap filling. Unlike a rigid tool, like a straight metal tool for example, that will always have troubles with curved surfaces. One last tool that I think everyone needs is a needle tool. The most obvious application is creating fur textures, but you can use it to sculpt all kinds of intricate details. Here's a couple of needles that I've found over the years. You can get them in different do-it-yourself store sets, or even build one yourself, like this one here, using aluminium wire and the files we already mentioned. I also picked up a set of these ball tools. They can both help with texture and also every time you need to carve some negative space, like when sculpting eye sockets or when you want to create a rivet of some sort. In general, each shop will have a certain tool that does it best. If you want to blend something together, don't use a rigid tool, but use a flexible tool that will adapt to your surface and that can press the clay into the tiniest recess and will smooth it out equally. If you want to sculpt a fine detail line, use a needle and not a blunt, oversized spatula without the proper edge. And if you want to sculpt the hexagonal indent, don't use whatever and spend 30 minutes on trying to get it somewhat right, just use, you get the idea. So why am I using Milliput and not green stuff? Milliput standard is finer grained, which means it holds more detail, but it also blends together more easily. Here's a bit of footage from Jazza again, using green stuff, showing exactly what I mean. The blobs are just not easy to blend together, and you will always have lines between them, unless you know exactly what you're doing. So if you're a beginner, this is going to cause you all kinds of troubles. Milliput just has that finer consistency and blends together easily. Like, look at this, I barely touched the surface and it's blended. And even if you have not properly blended parts, you can just sandpaper it when it's dry and get a super smooth result. Another point, again, illustrated perfectly in this Jazza footage. Look at the texture where he cut the material. You can see the rough grain size. And if you want to smooth this out with green stuff, you'll need to cover it. But with Milliput, you could just quickly sand it smooth. In general, Milliput just has a lot more versatility. You can even let it sit a while and it's going to have a more green stuff-like consistency. And if it's fresh, you can get the super sharp details more easily. You can move it a lot better and it's not going to fight you that much. It's not going to press against your tool as much as green stuff does. Can you still use green stuff? Of course you can. You can use whatever clay you want to use. You could use cheap and flayed brushes or brushes that are oversized. There's people that will create masterpieces with bad brushes. But why would you add additional hardship to something? Well, I'm on a timer. But why would you want to add additional hardship to something you're just about to learn and that is already motorically and cognitively demanding? Just like if you were using tools that are not fine enough. Clay that can't hold fine detail, even though you have the ability, is going to hold you back. Milliput just does what I want it to do. And on top of that, it's water soluble, which means you don't need Vaseline or any stuff like that to smooth it out. Just a brush or a proper tool and some water. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that clay, and I'll see you in the next one.
I'm Alex and welcome to 52 Miniatures. This video series is me exploring Warhammer Space Marines by building slightly unorthodox dioramas.
Bro, I'm so excited, you only have to give me some hands. Well, both of us. And I'm ready for you to paint me.
Today I'd like to cross-pollinate the world of future Warhammer.
About these hands?
With itself. Why are there no female Space Marines?
Oh no, I know that face. It's when you have a new idea and never finish the old one. Help! No! Stop!
Now, I'm not a philosopher like Alex. I'm a much simpler man. I see a goofy and silly idea and I just want to create it. To create my Mister of Battle, I had to find something that would fit the aesthetic of the Gothic sister armor. And I had a Stormcast sprue from the Dominion box lying around and their basic troops provide exactly what I need. And to make things extra hilarious, I picked a Space Marine head with an extra pronounced jaw and nose, and not the intricate and sophisticated female faces we usually see from Games Workshop. I knew the hand holding this bolter would be a fantasy hand, so I kept the end of the bolter handle to later reattach it. That would save me a little bit of sculpting. For conversions like these, you really want to keep as many elements as possible so you don't have to do them from scratch. One thing I have to mention is, yeah, this started as a silly idea, but I would still treat this as if it was a serious project. Hopefully you will also take away some ideas and tips for your own customizations. One of these important things is that any time you invest upfront to find the right bits that fit your idea and also fit your pose, the more time you save later. I knew I wanted the helmet off. This helmet is still an iconic part of the armor, so it had to be in there somewhere. And I also kept the loincloth and the coat part from the backside of this sister sculpt. I don't know how you would call it. I also intended to keep the typical tubes, and you can see that I tried to analyze how I could integrate them with the Stormcast body that I chose. But more on that later. I really wanted to keep the lower leg armor intact since it looked somewhat like sister armor, but I had to get rid of everything else, like the scales and the hip protectors. So I cut everything down to just a smooth cylindrical armor, and I kept the torso so I had a guide for all of the proportions. I would have to just attach the arms and everything else. I wanted a more stoic stance for my mister, so I had to straighten out the right leg, which means I had to separate the upper leg above the knee. And then I cut both elements down to where they would snug right into each other. And this saves me a lot of headache later. Next, I'm scraping and sanding off any unnecessary detail, like the leather straps or the Stormcast heraldry. And eventually, I also took the second leg off because I realized that I needed a bit of a wider stance. I also filled the torso so I could pin my elements properly, and filled out the holes in the legs so I'd have some sharp armor angles. When I glued the legs back into the torso, I also checked that all additional bits would still fit. Now, sister leg armor has a very distinct design, so I had to cut away some parts and fill some gaps on the new legs until they matched the design. And then I also filled the gaps between the armor parts, just copying the way it was done on the original sculpt, pressing folds into the magic sculpt, and then smoothing everything out with a wet brush. At that point, it was time to think about the chest and abdominal area. This was going to be the only part I would have to do some major sculpting on, but like I said, I wanted to keep the existing plastic parts as an armature and as a guideline to keep the proportions, which means I would just have to apply a thin layer of clay into which I would sculpt the details. I also had to make some room in the back area so I could keep the part of the sororiter shoulder armor where the backpack would slot in, avoiding having to redo that from scratch. Initially, I thought I might be able to keep the original shoulder guards, but they ended up looking too tiny. And once everything that wasn't needed was cut away, I pressed the part into a ball of clay that I placed on the shoulder to integrate it with the rest of the armor. The plates I wanted to add were a bit too big though, so I cut these down to a size that would fit. Time to do the chest piece, and that involved adding some,
boobs.
No, not boobs. Chest armor.
Boobs.
Yeah, okay, I added boobs. It just made sense to add these because the typical tactical fleur-de-lis on them are also an integral part of the sisters design. So I wanted the misters to also have them. How do you make sure they're of equal size? There's an easy trick. I start with 2 balls of clay that are the same size before I press them on. And once I had the volume and shape right, I made sure they were smooth again by running a wet brush across. I didn't really have this part blend out too much, so I decided I would add just enough material so that the major elements I wanted in there would fit, like the clothing on the front and the back, and then decided to move from there. And while I was dry fitting the arms, I realized I didn't have as much control over the pose if I just used the arms like this, so I decided to take the shoulders off to have more options. Then I added enough magic sculpt around the torso so I was both happy with the shape and made it smooth so I could work in the details. I tried sticking to a typical pattern you would find on a sororita armor, doing vertical lines, a middle row that looks like a zipper, and an outline around it at the bottom that would integrate with the part on the clothing. I also added some folds with my angled chisel color shaper for more credibility, just pressing the material flat here and there and restoring the line work. I glued the bolter to the hand, but didn't quite like the position of the wrist. It looked a bit too stiff, so I made a clean cut. And 30 minutes later, after I found the bolter in my carpet again, I pinned the new position in place. I also attached the left hand holding the helmet and I'm using a ball of clay at the joint area, so I have a connection, but I can still adjust all angles and find the right pose. At this point, it all started coming together, and I was really happy with the results so far. I used a similar approach to attach the shoulders. I can just push them on and adjust them while the clay is still workable, and then just let the clay dry once they are in the right place. And when the shoulders were cured, I quickly filled these gaps so that it would look like one piece. And no Sister of Battle would be complete without at least 7 fleur-de-lis, so my Mister also needed at least 5. And then I also added some additional symbols like the Imperial Eye on the left shoulder. Hi, Trovarian from the future here. I just finished editing this video, and when I was watching through it for the last time to check if everything is in order, I noticed that something important was missing that I think didn't come through the way it should. I started this mini almost 3 weeks ago, and for the first time in a while I did not think about what would get views on YouTube. I just worked on something for way too long that probably no one cares about. If anything, the nature of the project is probably going to generate a lot of negative comments, unless go ahead internet, prove me wrong. But I had a lot of fun not thinking about what's the hot new release, what's a topic that would get a lot of clicks, and honestly that was such a relief. And I think moving forward, my videos will focus more on documenting the projects that I really want to do, even if the minis I'll be using are maybe 2 years old and have no influence whatsoever on getting picked up by the algorithm. I just had too much fun doing this one, and ironically, I think this is also the best paint job I've done in a while. Just a real eye-opener. I really thought about keeping the buzz cut. The way that the jar head was shaped and how it integrated with the rest of the curves looked really interesting, but for the memes I decided to go for the traditional bob cut instead, first building all the volume of hair and then carving out some individual strains. Generally, I try not to go too detailed here because for the scale, stylized hair is usually enough and you can paint more detail without any excessive grooves getting in the way and the pigment pooling in them. I try to add some flow and more details to the hair around the face, as the contrast of skin color would pronounce these areas a lot more, which will make up for the lack of detail in the rest of the hair. For all of this, my color shaper is the perfect tool because it can create smooth curves and sharp angles, especially if the clay is already a bit cured. Added a few more details, but I really didn't want to get bogged down in them. Like, I added more fleur-de-lis, but I completely skipped the purity seals. It's just a compromise I have to make whenever I do stuff for YouTube. Eventually the video has to come out and I'm cutting a few corners. You can do a lot more interesting things with paint on the bigger surfaces, and I also enjoy that. So I really like how the conversion turned out. The upfront planning paid off, all elements fit together well, and limited the sculpting I had to do. And I think the parts I had to sculpt blend in nicely and fit the general style of the sororitas. For anything I paint, I kind of want to try something new. So here, for the color scheme, I wanted to try a cream-colored armor that still had a lot of depth. So I applied a first layer of khaki, and then I washed it with Rhinoxide to get really deep shadows in the recesses. And then using Game Colors Earth, which is a color similar to English Uniform or Steel Legion Drab, I made everything more uniform again. Then mixing in skin tones, I built the cream midtones, leaving shadows on all elements of the armor visible. I highlighted some parts a bit more like a metallic surface, like the round parts of the backpack, and then moved into more specular highlights with a mix of khaki and really bright skin tones. For the sake of keeping this video short, I'm only showing the general ideas of why I painted the mini the way I did. Also, I'll be honest, I have no idea if anyone even wants to watch me paint something like this. That doesn't really exist in Warhammer lore or as a miniature. Of course, you can still adapt everything I show here to other minis like Stormcasts or Sisters, Eldar, probably even Space Marines, but who knows. In any case, I'll upload the full painting process as a series of step-by-step videos on my Patreon, if you want to see it as painted start to finish, or if you want to learn more about any individual part of the process. I chose a mix of black and turquoise as the base color for the core set and added more and more skin tone to the mix to keep the overall coherency as I highlighted it up. And I shaded it down with Rhinox hide for the same reason. I was initially torn about how to do the reds on the cloth, but ultimately decided to further try the new game colors, and to test their properties, I switched to a slightly different approach. So the initial layer of bright red took a while, but when it was done, I shaded it down with black, and then before adding back saturation, I blocked in the highlights with a bright skin tone. I mainly wanted to test the new game color's red coverage, but I think this is a good way to avoid your reds turning too orange or too pink when you highlight them, and it's really quick for an okay result. The tubes around the neck are easily turned into something interesting using this non-metallic pattern with a high contrast main reflection and the secondary highlight in the color of the armor reflecting from below. I wanted a rather saturated color for the face, so I started from a saturated skin color and I was shading it even more with red oxide by Chimera colors to increase the effect. I gave the lips a purple tone and applied a specular highlight, and then gave the chin a 5 o'clock shadow by adding gray to my base skin color. And then using more yellowish tones, I applied the highlights in the areas that define the facial features and continued to build light on the face. I gave the eyes a prominent black outline and added the white of the eyes, and I did my best not to ruin everything when painting the pupils. The hair received the same base color as the corset, but I made sure to build more specular highlights and go all the way to white for that comic book hair effect or that Photoshop look that L'Oreal uses for their hair color promotions. I chose to go with a very warm color for my gold, using a more reddish base tone and gradually building my reflections with shades of yellow, and finally adding white to maximize contrast. I like sculpting these large fleur-de-lis or other emblems, and I always make sure to create sharp edges, because when doing non-metallic metal on them, you can just go wild with contrast, and I really am satisfied with the result. The last details to do were the visor of the helmet and the bolter. So while we take a look at the final showcase, remember that you should always enjoy the hobby the way you want. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Find the niche you enjoy, whether that's gaming, painting your minis true to the lore, or doing your own thing. Hopefully this video has helped you, encourage you to do exactly that. And finally, let me say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You guys are the reason these videos exist. I wanted this flayed one to be bigger and not as frail looking as the official models, so I thought about basing them on Immortals, but eventually I settled on Praetorians because the way their heads are sunk in a bit more into their chests just looked a bit more interesting. In the background, even though lesser Necrons are more likely, any Necron can fall to the flayed one curse, so I wanted to toy with that idea. When I showed the first draft of this guy on my Discord, people brought up that this reminded them a lot of the Twice Dead King novels, which is really what I wanted to go for, thinking about what a Necron noble that fell to the curse could potentially look like. So this is Steve from the 3rd Regiment. Just ignore the metal thing hanging from his waist. Whenever I start a kitbash, I try to assemble the main elements and then do a bit of brainstorming, where I fiddle with the elements to find a pose and see what parts work together and which don't. And at this point I also checked how the flayed one parts would fit with this body. I find this phase really important in any kitbash because often I will drop ideas I thought were really good for better ones because they didn't pass the reality check. I had this picture saved in my inspiration folder and it influenced a lot of the ideas that would go into this kitbash. The shoulders should direct the viewer more towards the skeleton on the back, making the gruesome story even more center part of the mini, and frame the head in a way that it almost disappears, leading to a grotesque situation where the human remains almost look like an elongated head on top of this abomination. I wanted to fit a flayed one spine on the back, and that, as well as the ribcage, needed some space. So I started to hack away some of the elements. However, with sculpting, you always need something like an armature, a solid part you can press your clay on, so it doesn't wobble and move. And that's why I'm leaving some of these parts that would line up with the bulkier ridges on the back of the shoulders, so I could extend them forward. And as I'm pressing on clay, I try to find a design that would fit my idea, sloping the sides more and making everything wrap more around the area of the face. It's better to be patient here and wait for that initial draft to be hard so we are not smooshing everything flat again with the next layer. And again, the first layer acts as a foundation for a final, more detailed layer. At this point, I'm smoothing out areas with this larger color shaper on the fly, and at the same time I try to push the ridge parts into shape. It's okay though if not everything has super sharp angles at this point, because I'll sand all the parts smooth when everything is cured, and you definitely need a bit of patience here not to go too fast and screw things up. The old Skeleton Warrior box is a good resource for skeleton parts like arms and chests, and I'm kinda sad to see it go away with the new release. I should have bought at least one extra box before it got discontinued. I only attached the ribcage at this point because I wanted to see the bigger picture before attaching the arms. In the artwork that inspired me, you can see another figure in the back, where one of the victims still has its helmet on, and I wanted to copy that. I clipped out a skull with a dislocated jaw from the Games Workshop skull sprues and used one of the new Cadian helmets that I cut down and milled out so it would be flexible with how I can put it on the skull. Again, I checked how everything would fit together and tried to find a position I liked before gluing everything together. I don't know why, but using separate elements, reworking them and putting them together with a new purpose is just really satisfying, and I need to do it more. With these main elements established, I can now smooth out everything and finalize the angles. At this point I had to think about the final pose, and for that I needed the base to be finished. Epic Basing just released their Battlefield Bones and Skull Collector packs that were a perfect fit for the theme. I figured this guy would scavenge the killing fields after a more or less recent battle and search for some human loincloth that would make his complexion look a lot healthier. And not sure why, but this whole skinning people thing gave me a lot of macabre ideas, and looking at one of these loose skeleton jaws on the basing element, I took one of the new Cadia heads and cut it in shape so it would fit right on top of this jaw. So I cut away the lower jaw, I kept the upper lip and some of the cheeks, so the two parts would fit together perfectly. I had to make some room and cut away one of the resin skulls and then glued the head onto the jaw. I just had to sculpt a little bit of skin overhanging to cover the gap between the two parts. To build the base, I took some epoxy clay and mushed it flat on a plastic base. Using some broken concrete and more skull parts by Epic Basing, I slowly cobbled together a scene and dry fitted the mini occasionally. This video is not sponsored by Epic Basing, but they kindly gave me a 10% discount voucher that you can find in the description. It's going to last until the end of February if you want to get any of their STLs or some resin bits for your own bases, like these skull and bone sets or sandbags, crates, and so on. Go check them out. Their stuff really helped me level up my basing game, and they're good, creative people who I think deserve the shout out. I also slapped on one of these monoliths that worked pretty nicely with the Necron theme, added more skulls and bones, a hand-sculpted rock here and there to tie everything together, and then added some grouts in the recesses. With the base done, I could finally add the head because now I knew the direction the Necron was walking in, which would dictate where the face should look. Before adding the skin, I made sure I had the arms of the skeleton in place because I knew I would also cover them partially with it. I started by covering the face, and we will talk about my approach for these skin parts in a bit. Here I just slapped together tiny bits of clay so I wouldn't accidentally cover too much in one go. For example, I wanted both eyes to still be very visible as well as most of the teeth, because I wanted them looking out from under the flesh mask in a menacing way. Just like with painting, it's always good to add some extra details to large flat areas, and that's why I sculpted a little cut just above the eye area and added some extra definition where the skin stretches over the cheeks. I felt like if you take the skin off of a head, it's only natural you could not quite do that without hair still attached to it. And I thought it would add a bit of goofiness if I gave this Necron a haircut. First I added enough clay so I had some volume to work with, and then structured bigger strands of hair and eventually added a little bit of extra detail. I have a full video tutorial about how to sculpt hair and fur on my Patreon and in the YouTube members section if you're interested in learning more. I wanted to add an explanation for why the arm of the skeleton stays in place the way it is, so I covered the end with a bit of skin, adding enough clay so I then could place a spike into it, making it look like the arm got impaled on it. I got the spikes from one of the arms that I tried to fit into the Kitbash, but ultimately decided would be a bit over the top. That's why I shortened the claws on one of the arms, then cutting them into shape and scraping and sanding them more flat and delicate. Now let's talk about the two approaches I used for doing the skin. The first one is to apply all the outlines of the area that would be covered, working on the edges a bit so it had a more credible structure and so it looked like actual tissue stretching over the metal. And then filling in the rest. This way I have a lot more control over how thick the layer will be in the end, and I don't have a lot of excess material I have to cut away. The second approach is to take pre-cut sheets and attaching them to the Mini. This is particularly useful when you want to create parts that float in the wind or to show movement and anything that overhangs the edges of the Mini. I'm using an old glass cover from a picture frame for this, where I put down a lot of water and a portion of my epoxy clay. I usually let the clay cure a few minutes so it doesn't dissolve too much in the water, and it also doesn't rip as easily. With this technique you need to make sure that at least your overhang is already detailed the way you want it, because it's not that easy to press the tool against some uncured, free-floating clay without mushing it or pushing it into weird shapes. Also personally, I tend to make these sheets too big, as you can see, and then I have to correct a lot. It's no big deal, but just something to keep in mind if you want to save some time. I'm using all kinds of different tools to cut the sheet down, smooth it out, and add some structure and texture to it until I'm happy with the result. I prepared a couple of these small rolls of clay that resemble small spikes, and once they were cured, I cut them in half so I could press them into fresh sheets of clay here and there, so it looked like they were helping to hold the skin in place. Just like that bigger spike I showed you earlier from a plastic talon. Moving between the two approaches, I covered more and more area with skin, and I also dragged some parts up into the skeleton, which almost makes it look like they're holding Steve in place there. And I'm trying not to just slap some flat sheets of clay on. I'm fraying the edges and I'm creating some wrinkles and folds and parts that stretch more than others, so the flat surfaces wouldn't look too boring later during the painting. I went ahead and covered more and more parts with these sheets and put more detailing work in. And this is a good exercise in how some thin tissue would behave over hard surfaces and hard folds and creates crevices and so on. And whenever I was happy with the result, I swept over it with a damp brush as usual for some extra smoothness. I added some lost details, like a few more of these spikes, and then attached the second arm to finish out the dramatic pose. So let's get this bad boy painted up. I first applied a layer of dark aluminium over a black base coat and then mixed burnt umber ink with contrast medium to stain the armor, similar to what I did in my 9th edition Necrons video. I also mixed contrast medium with some black and abyssal turquoise to add a shade of blue to the metallics as well. This gives some nice variety and a good base to work off of. I gave all the skin parts an opaque layer of elf skin tone and then added washes of red oxide. The goal was to create a feeling of fresh skin. I didn't think too much about realism though, I just went with rule of cool and I just liked the saturation that red oxide gave. I tidied the skin parts up with elf skin tone and then gradually added more and more wolf grey to place additional highlights. The blue takes the saturation out of the highlights, which contrasts nicely against the saturated shade areas. I wanted Steve's remains to look older and like they were stuck to the back of our Flayed One for a while now, so I started with a layer of dark brown over black and gradually worked the highlights up through various earth and khaki tones, using stippling to create more textured gradients. I quickly treated the hair to a couple of highlights over a blue and black base mix. And then went back to the metallics and Steve's helmet for a while, adding rust washes for some color variety. I wanted the helmet to look really old and worn out, and I just wanted to try something different, so I washed some green tones over the dark metal color I had on the helmet left from airbrushing the metallics. Then I treated the rest of the metallics to some highlights and also stippled on additional metal where paint would have flaked off on the helmet, like on the edges and the more exposed parts. I also brought back some highlights on the claws, mainly on the very edges, but also made sure there were some reflections on the blade parts. And then also brought back some more shine to the rest of the armor. I wanted to try the new Game Color FX paints, so I created an inhomogeneous mix of the two blood products they created, and then used a splayed brush to create spilled blood and blood splatter in some strategic areas. I usually give my Necrons this glow from within in various colors, and I think I have it dialed in for this orange variant by now, starting from a white base coat on the parts I want to glow. Then I airbrushed on a layer of Imperial Fist contrast paint. The funny thing is, you could probably stop at any of these stages and it would look really good. But I followed the yellow up with a few layers of thinned down fluorescent orange. Finally, I added a mix of white and Imperial Fist towards the center that I wanted a lot brighter to make it look like the light is more intense there. I said at the beginning that I wanted the eyes to menacingly glow out from under the flesh mask, so I also gave them the same treatment. applying a layer of Imperial Fists over the white eyeballs. And then I added a few washes of the fluorescent paint. And I also followed this up with the last highlight of the yellow mix. And this is the result. I kinda like how the skin stands out against the darker parts of the armor. I guess if I wanted to spend more time on this, the way to go would be to add more variety on the skin color, making some parts look older and less bright. But overall, I'm happy with how this turned out, and I think I particularly like the more menacing pose and the over-the-top OSL. That maybe could be attributed to the virus taking over. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you are looking for more Necron videos, you can check out any of these two on screen, offering two distinctly awesome painting approaches. Necrons are fun, what can I say? So Games Workshop came out with these, and they sent me a set to try out and give my opinion on. And I didn't know whether or not I should make this review, because there's a huge elephant in the room. You can either get these four, or you can get all of these tools for almost 50 bucks less. That's right, all of this. But who knows, maybe the markup is worth it? We're going to find out in this video. And while we're at it, I'm going to introduce you to my little arsenal here, which does exactly the same thing as these, and spoiler alert, much more. So who knows, maybe you're going to find out about a tool that will truly make your Warhammer hobby better than ever. Let's start with the most expensive tool of the bunch, the Fine Detail Cutter. Now, a few general things about this type of cutter. Typically, the larger ones would be called sprue cutters, and these more delicate ones nippers. Sprue cutters are generally larger and made to deal with thicker parts, while nippers are for what we usually do, getting parts out of the sprue. So we will focus on that. They can come in stamped sheet, joined with some type of rivet, and forged ones with these overlapping joints. The latter usually being higher quality and more pricey, mainly because they keep the jaws from shifting and the edges from misaligning and pinching the material. You can already see that the Games Workshop one is stamped sheet, so this is definitely not what should drive the price up. One thing that irks me is that they went with only one of the jaws having a sharp edge compared to the earlier version. This type of nipper is often used in scale modeling, where it's even more important not to damage the delicate parts, and the idea is that the blunt side stabilizes while the sharp side provides a clean cut through the material. And sure, you can sell this as a fancy new design, and that's why it's so expensive, but it's actually really counterproductive, because it's important not to stress the material too much while you're clipping off parts from the sprue. The usefulness of this design also depends on the type of plastic we're working with. Most of the time, scale modeling plastic is hard, and that's why the design kind of works there, but the Games Workshop plastic is really soft. To illustrate what I mean, I use these new cutters on a thicker sprue, and what happens is you end up pinching the material. It's deformed by the flat edge, and you get these white stretch marks and deformations as a result. But of course, to be fair, we need to judge it in a more appropriate situation, so let's cut out a part of the sprue instead. But even here you can see that this is not really the desired result, and you can potentially damage the part, and you will have to add a lot more additional time to fix it. I don't really get it. Why create a product that is not compatible with your plastic? Why not think about what works with the material you're using for your minis and design a tool from there? But hey, who am I to tell a multi-billion-dollar company what to do? Let's see how my cutter performs in comparison. Here's a cut through some thick sprue material, which results in way less pinching and stretching because it has two sharp edges. And here it is, close to parts that we want to remove from the sprue. Pretty neat. So this is in no way a high-end tool, but it is enough for what we want to do. This is where I should show you 5 other versions of nippers, but I don't own any, because once I've found something that works, I'm not buying additional stuff only because it might be marginally better. I have these nippers since 10 years, and you can see that the blades are still aligned and it cuts like day one. However, if you want a few tips on what to look for in higher quality tools, you should definitely go for welded over stamped sheet. The most important thing is look for the sharpest edges you can find. Usually the smaller the angles of the edge on the jaws, the sharper the tool is and the less deformations you get. On screen you can see some of the recommendations I researched. I will leave a link to all of the tools that I am using and that I'm mentioning in the description, just in case you find them interesting and maybe want to get them. Let's get to the next tool, which is the mold line remover. I never owned the first iteration, I just never saw the need, so I cannot compare how much this narrower nose improves its function. But I never got the point of a blunt mold line remover anyway. It might work for super obvious lines, but for more complex shapes like these, no chance. You can't even reach them. I guess if you are in a hurry and you really don't care about the not so obvious lines still showing, sure, this is fine. But even then, I'd assume you would own some sort of hobby knife. Just look at this magic trick and how I turn these separate tools into a two-in-one tool. I have always just removed mold lines with a scalpel. It has an arrow tip, you can reach everywhere, even complex shapes are no problem. And if you really, really wanted a blunt surface to work with, you just turn it around. What is this? I can't quite make it out. Oh, it's a base. You can remove flash from bases. Well, that changes everything. If you want to get more sophisticated than a hobby knife with your mold line removal, you can always use sandpaper or sanding sticks instead. You can buy these, but I literally just glued some sandpaper to a stick here. Can you imagine having to sell this to someone as the best thing to remove mold lines? Well, you know, this curve here, it's perfect for treating round surfaces. And the straight line here, also the notch.
But you could just use a hobby knife.
Shh, now Timmy, go away. That will be $25. Next up we have the new knife. It holds these standard scalpel blades which are kept in place by this vice mechanism, controlled by the rotating handle back here. It also has a notch over the blade which technically appears like a good idea on first sight, because you can place your finger on it like this more comfortably and apply more force when needed, even though I don't know if I recommend to apply more force with a blade. It also has the plastic casing. I guess it was easier to mold the ergonomic shape, which I think is kind of overkill. You don't really need it. At the same time, it still feels cheap because of it, and even a tiny bit flimsy. I just prefer metal handles. One thing that bothers me is that putting in the blades is a bit more dangerous than with other types, simply because the notch up here is getting in the way of pushing down the blade, while you can just slide it in with one of these other types. I just don't think any of these new features justify the price point. A basic knife like this with extra blades is $5.99. It does not need to be any more expensive. The quality does not improve if you're buying a $10.99 version, and it does not get more suited for what we are doing when you're buying a $19.99 version. But what you can get for $19.99 is a set like this, which offers you a lot more blade shapes and even chisel type blades. And honestly, this was one of the best purchases I ever made, because it has helped me with kitbashing, resculpts, terrain building, and so on for the last 15 years. I even built and converted most of my Golden Demon entries with this. The drill comes with a couple of extra drill bits with different diameters. It also has this fancy vice mechanism again, so it's pretty easy to switch between the bits. While I was testing it, again, it felt a bit flimsy, but what was really annoying was the two flaps on the side here, which kind of get in the way while twisting the drill. There just isn't any real comfortable way to use it. And I don't even know what their purpose is to begin with. Maybe someone of you has an idea? What I personally have been using over the years is this hand drill that I got from a local do-it-yourself store for about $7 back in the day. It came with a lot of extra drill bits, and they're fine for the plastic GW uses. Eventually I got some higher quality bits as the old ones started breaking, but that was back when metal minis were still a thing. I can even store some extra bits back here in the handle, because as I mainly use this hand drill for pinning and fitting my minis to a base. Now that's actually one thing that the Games Workshop tool has over something like this. The front holds all kinds of diameters more easily. You don't have to change anything. But whenever I need a larger diameters or more heavy duty drilling, I use this instead. It's a mini Dremel that's cordless, and that's super comfortable to use because it's so small. It speeds up things like drilling out bolt holes massively. Especially if you're doing armies, I can only recommend this, and it comes with all kinds of extra bits like cutting discs, different milling bits if you want to convert your minis, and you can even polish a turret with it. If you only are going to use it to drill, there's special tools for that, and those are even cheaper, but this one is super versatile and it's less than the Games Workshop hand drill, while at the same time giving you so many more possibilities for your hobby. Now, the extra money that you saved at this point, you can invest into other helpful things like magnifying glasses, sandpaper, or proper pliers, or anything that goes beyond the basics of miniature building. Maybe you could get a foam cutter or some precision saws like these, or these, which are my favorite conversion tools whenever I need a clean cut quickly. I don't think it comes as a surprise when I say I have a problem with these tools being as expensive as they are. The problem is that neither are the innovations that great to justify the price, nor did they use any expensive material or workmanship to manufacture these. But an even bigger problem I have with the GW tools is you kind of need most of these to start the hobby. I mean, except for this. So it's really easy to talk beginners into buying these. After all, you need a way to get your parts out of the sprue, right? Might as well just grab this while you're shopping anyway. Like, no one that has any kind of experience or put a little research into hobby tools will buy this over something they already have. So in a way, this is a bit of a newbie trap, and that just feels super wrong. Is this really the occasion where you have to make money off of your customers, and especially new customers? Once people are hooked on the hobby, they will spend anyway. I know it. You know it, we're all hooked on plastic crack. And the point is, you don't have to come up with your own designs. Like, I'm pretty sure you could find some solid tools to rebrand. If Army Painter can do it, I'm pretty sure Games Workshop can do it. You could offer a set of nippers, knife, and a drill for $35, and people would be like,
This hobby is pretty cheap.
either GW are in this bubble where they have been marketing the we are the hobby approach so hard that they really think a lot of the stuff that they're selling isn't available anywhere for way less money and a lot more practical too. Or they're plainly just trying to make as much money off of these tools as they can. And I don't know which I find more irritating. I really should not upload this video. Games Workshop is going to fire me.
Oh, Warhammer 40k, where have we gone wrong? What happened? I look at all these artworks and they're full of crazy detail, almost overloaded with gothic elements, absurd technology. Everyone is carrying around relics like the Emperor's toenail, you know, the one that he lost fighting that one guy. Or Battle Brother what's-his-name, skeletonized trigger finger, and all this over-the-top iconography. Just a world gone mad. But when it comes to models, this is what we get. Particularly Space Marines, and especially with the Primaris update, the armor design going for a more minimalist, high-tech aesthetic. The Terminators especially look really clean and almost sterile. And don't get me wrong, I kind of like that for painting purposes, and you can still do a lot to make them more gritty just with paint. But the reason I got into 40k was this crazy gothic aesthetic of a world plastered in quasi-religious relics and arcane technology that also has this absurd added level of mysticism, needing tech priests to make it work. And even though the new knights in the Deathwing Assault box provided a significant update for the aesthetic, I still didn't quite feel it. The Dark Angels I'm thinking of look brooding. Hooded figures, clad in robes, books with forbidden knowledge, skulls and candles and purity seals everywhere. If we think of the seller's superstitious medieval aesthetic on Space Marines, Dark Angels are the poster boys, and this is where my mind is going to. I had a rough idea about which elements I wanted to keep, so I assembled these fundamental parts and then started to play around with some 3D printed elements. Great Tide Studio has just come out with their Eternal Pilgrims Terminator set, which fit my vision perfectly. It's a great release if you want to gothic up your Deathwing Terminators. They added torsos with additional iconography, all kinds of shoulders with relics, and more gothic designs. A ton of weapon options, shields, cloaks, and even a banner. They kindly provided me with the STL files, but also a discount code to pass on to you to apply on checkout for a 20% discount. You can find a link in the video description. So if you want to pick up the Dark Angels pack or any of their other accessories that are a great way to customize your 40k armies, now's the perfect occasion to grab some of these amazing STLs and save some money while doing so. I started by swapping out shin guards from the new set until I was happy with the design, and then moved on to the shoulders. I knew I wanted the shoulders to be as over the top as possible to make the knights look bulkier, but also more ridiculous in their use of icons. So I tried a few of these new Grey Tide Studio shoulders, but also looked at their older Eternal Crusader pack, which is their absolute bestseller, and just one of the things that you can also grab at a 20% discount. It was designed for regular Space Marines and not Terminators, which was a bit of a problem, because obviously they would not fit the bigger Terminators. But since I had the new STL pack, I could just drag the old designs over the new ones and resize them to where they looked appropriate. In my case, that meant scaling them up to 112%. The inside, of course, was designed for regular Space Marines, so I had to fiddle a bit with the arms, and I ended up cutting down the shoulder connectors to where the new guards would fit. So that was a bit of work, but the result looks amazing, so it was absolutely worth it. I was dry fitting both arms and the shield to find a pose I was happy with before I glued everything but the shield in place. I don't really like sub-assemblies, but gluing the shield on after everything was painted wouldn't be a problem in this case. I got rid of some of the detail on the back of the armor and took some 3D printed cannonballs. This pack here had a few skulls added as a base, which I thought would be a great addition for the general theme I was going for. I needed some connection between the armor and the candles, otherwise it would look like the elements were just floating there. So I slapped on some epoxy putty and pressed the elements in, using some super glue where the putty was not enough to hold everything in place. Again, I was dry fitting a lot of different options and then gradually added more and more candles until everything looked over the top, and I was happy with the result. I had to use a bit more putty than I initially wanted to, because the flat armor is angled, which would also mean the candles would be standing at an angle, but that would have looked weird, and since I wanted them to stand upright, I had to cover the gaps that resulted from this difference. So in the end, I invested quite some time into fleshing out these wax bases and the drops, but I think it was worth it. I glued a 3D printed book and a bunch of scrolls to the shield, and I wanted to add a detail that would look like it's holding the book in place. So I added a strap running across the book that aligned perfectly with the straps already on the scrolls. The open rope didn't look bad, but I wanted to add a Dark Angel freehand symbol to the chest, so I needed to cover it up with epoxy clay. After outlining the rope, I just filled in the rest smoothly and pressed in a few folds with the color shaper while the putty was still workable. I went a bit light on the folds so the freehand would be easy to paint and not look too distorted. I built a rocky base for this one using some 3D printed slate by Epic Basing, and one trick that makes basing a lot easier is to glue the features that your mini is standing on to the feet and then glue these to the base. That way you don't have to fight with gaps under the feet, and any other gap you can just fill with texture paste or sand without worrying too much. After adding a few sandbags and dead wood as additional features, I just added sand to tie everything together. So that's the conversion done. Took a bit longer than I expected, mainly because of the 3D printing and having to spend some time to find all the candles, books, and resizing the shoulders and just making sure that everything fits perfectly. I especially like how the candles turned out, like how they're sloping upwards from the shoulders to that one in the middle, stretching the whole miniature a bit and making the knights look a bit taller, especially compared to regular Terminators. And I think that's a good thing because you really want to have them stand out on the battlefield. And the helmet from the new Grey Tide Studios pack for Dark Angels fits that aesthetic perfectly because it's a bit taller and less bulky than the originals. And I just like how ludicrous the concept of the knights being plastered in candles looks. It's just that right amount of stupid and over the top that I expect from Warhammer 40k, and it fits right with these artworks that I showed you initially. I mixed some dark gray with the first layer of beige, which would serve as a desaturated color in the shadow, and apply the first solid coat. Then I added a cenital coat of pure beige to bring back some warmth in the highlights, and finally added some off-whites to highlight the brightest parts of the armor. Then I mixed a rather diluted wash of snakebite leather and covered all of the mini, making sure the recesses were darkened and most of the armor was slightly stained. As you can see in the back, This does create nice depth, especially since I used some pure contrast medium to get rid of the wash on parts I wanted to remain bright. I did some cleanup like here on the legs with vampiric flesh, which was my original beige color, and then added a bit of off-white and added some subtle highlights on all areas, especially on the edges of the mini and all exposed parts like the helmet, which resulted in a nice bright bone color. I went for more subtle highlights like here on the back of the feet, and I made them more pronounced on smaller features like this cylindrical scaffolding, where I painted main reflections and bounce lights for some extra detail. I decided to go for a steel or silver colored detail on the trim of the shoulders and detail of the armor, as gold would not stand out enough in my opinion, and then proceeded to paint the robe. To go with the excessive heraldry theme and making it look more like medieval knight heraldry, I went for a divided two-colored tabard. I know it's not a tabard, but let's be honest, who cares? Splitting it between green and white. I went for a dark saturated green on one side and a green tinted white on the other side, which is why I used Nurgling green as a base that I highlighted with white. And then I used the Nurgling green to highlight the green parts, which desaturated the green a lot, but that just tied in better with the overall aesthetic. Then I painted a typical wing icon on the chest. I was looking at a lot of references to get the shapes right. I fully painted one side first so I could just mirror the other half, which made everything a lot easier because I had all the measurements and distances that I had, and I just had to copy it to the other side. I made sure that the highlights on the wing shape fit the highlights I initially established on the main color. If you want to see anything that I painted in this video in more detail, I will gradually upload videos with all the steps as additional footage on my Patreon. There'll be a link in the description. I'm mixing the highlights for the metal from just black and this bright blue. The blue adds a satisfying color quality to the gray, making it look more like metal. And I define all edges and larger reflections to mimic how light would reflect off of the metal. While true metallics are generally faster and it's probably easier to make them look great with little effort, I just love the control you have over where the reflections go when you are using regular acrylic paint. If I could, I would just paint everything on a mini with a brush and regular acrylic paint, because that's what I enjoy the most. I will admit that I had no clear plan for the candles. At first I thought I would make them this dark burgundy red, as that would be a color that would fit the rest of the composition. But after I had the base color down, I knew that that was not the way to go. Especially since I wanted to paint the flames in a reddish orange color, and that would just clash. So what I did instead was to use the dark red as an underpainting color that would draw all of the candles together, even though I painted them all slightly different in the end. After that I used off-white and mixed it into these base colors to get more of a universal highlight color. For the bright flames I started from white, and then I gave them one pass of fluorescent yellow. That was followed by fluorescent orange, leaving the inner areas brighter to give the illusion of hotter flames that cool outwards. Lastly, I added red to the orange and shaded deeper recesses. Eventually I went back to paint white on all parts adjacent to the flames to set up some light reflections. And then I just repeated the process with the fluorescent paints. Adding a faint glow with red and orange to the outside area rounded out the effect. Power weapons as sacred relics of the Imperium are always a contagious topic for me, each of them pulsating with the divine energy of the Omnissiah's blessing. For some, as elusive as the shifting tides of the warp, and talking about them is just like navigating the treacherous currents of the Immaterium itself. For purists, they have to be blue, the azure color symbolizing purity, a bright beacon against the darkness of heresy. To me, especially in the context of the inner circle of the Dark Angels, embracing whispers of forbidden knowledge and arcane power, the line of loyalty and heresy blurs, and I wanted to stray from the usual power sword concept to make them look more like relic weapons, ancient, mysterious, and dark. So on top of an initial yellow-brown gradient to black, I added layers of turquoise, which blended them together into an interesting green. And then adding a desaturated green as a highlight, the general hue being a subtle reminder of the pure bluish tint. But at the same time to have a more yellowish color shift before it transitions into a black that symbolizes a technology so arcane it would plunge a simple human mind into despair if they tried to understand it.
Heresy.
Eventually, I added more and more white for the highlights, contrasting against the dark parts closer to the hilt, making it look like there's energy pulsating outwards towards the tip. I started the lower half of the sword by painting the lower edge red-brown, as I wanted it to reflect the reddish earth I would later add to the base, and then I added a subtle turquoise hue to the rest of the black. At last, I was painting a very bright edge on the curve of the blade, maximizing the contrast against the black, and I painted the handle in a dark non-metallic gold, to play on the idea that this relic is absorbing more light than it is reflecting, hungry to consume both light and whatever it is touching during battle. After painting some details like the purity seals and leather straps, and also the skulls, I painted the icons on the left shoulder in gold, and then started on the last important element, which is the shield. And I wanted to make them look rather beat up without explicitly painting battle damage, so everything I do is rough and loose, starting with the base red. Then I applied more saturated on the side that is facing up, and I added some dark gray to desaturate the red on the lower half that would be facing down. And while everything was still somewhat wet, I started to add highlights with a brighter red. As you can see, the result is spotty, but that's actually exactly what I was aiming for. It just adds imperfections and creates that worn look. After giving the red parts an outline of edge highlights, I also added some brush strokes, again using the brush very loosely, sometimes leaving lines, sometimes dots, and sometimes more complicated shapes that add to the battered aesthetic, while building more light on the main body of the shield. Then I gave the other elements, like the book and scrolls, and also the skulls and swords, their main color, before I brought back some saturation with a glaze of pure red. I wanted the metal parts to look rather dark to fit the gothic aesthetic, so I started from black and blocked in the highlights, focusing on credible placement more than blending. Like this first highlight here on the handle, just a line of bright blue-gray, and after adding secondary reflections, I added a couple of highlight steps all the way towards pure white. For the parts facing down, I did add the reddish tone I already used on a sword, and I think using that on all metal parts ties together the color scheme nicely, and makes it look more credible. I covered the books, scrolls and purity seals in different shades of beige, and gave them a subtle wash with thinned down skeleton horde to tie them together. And finally, I scribbled some symbols and writing on with a brown and gray mix. I glued the shield to the mini with super glue and then set out to finish the base. I made a mix of red and beige pigment, and added a little bit of parasite brown to draw them both together, and then just dabbed it into the recesses, getting rid of any stains on the higher up parts, using a damp brush. That gives a more credible result because that's how a small dust particle would settle. One last thing to do was to paint the eyes, and this came as a bit of a shock to me because I only noticed this after I was almost done painting, but my printer messed up and a lot of the detail of the eyes was clogged. It's funny too because there's different levels of clogging going on, both on the right and the left. Both have a hole in there that made it almost impossible to do something good with it, because there's always that shadow there messing with the glow effect that I wanted to do. I guess it's just a friendly reminder to do some quality control after printing. And finally, here's the result. If only it were as easy for Games Workshop to fix the knights in-game so they would be a valid choice for competitive lists. I really enjoyed collecting all these bits that would make my vision of Dark Angels come to life, and I'm looking forward to customizing more of them. More Inner Circle members, Fallen Ones, and I also have some ideas for the Risen. In the meantime, why not watch one of these videos on screen? And finally, thanks a lot to my patrons and YouTube members for making these videos possible. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and I'll see you in the next one. Inquisitor Coteaz was one of the first miniatures I ever painted, and it was truly badass. Only eclipsed by the even more badass artwork on the cover of the Codex Demon Hunters. Nothing to me spelled Warhammer 40k more than this character, and I remember painting the model like it was yesterday, even though it was over 20 years ago. When I saw the silhouette pop up in my emails, I was really excited.
I know what this is. It's happening.
Oh hell yeah! Yeah! Oh god no, what is this?
Look how they mess with my boy.
Overall, it just doesn't have the commanding presence the old model and the artwork are oozing. It looks more like a comedic relief character. And I know I complained a lot about too much detail in this video, but my god, Games Workshop, you didn't have to get rid of all the detail on this one. But in this video, I'm going to kitbash the shit out of the new model, and I'll try to come up with something that does the character justice. But I'm not going to lie, this one is going to be one hell of a challenge. Okay, well, let's do this. Conversions don't just start with making the first cut. It involves a lot of planning ahead before you even put a nipper to that sweet plastic crack. And in this case, there's a few factors that would influence my game plan. First of all, converting Games Workshop minis isn't what it used to be in the 2000s. Nowadays, the models have so many parts that integrate into each other while assembling, you actually do need to read that little booklet that comes with it, which is made almost impossible for me by the fact that I have a Y chromosome.
If it still doesn't work out, then you don't deserve to have said item.
So I need to assemble a lot of this model before I start the conversion. A good example is the legs coming in 2 parts. I obviously have to glue these together, even if I have to later cut them apart in different places. But not only that, the torso is also connected to the feet, and then there's a way how the left arm integrates with the cape and so on. And that leads us to the second thought that goes into my kit bashes. I try to keep as many parts of the original I can, even if I have to alter them. Simply because this helps so much with keeping the proportions of the body parts credible, because you don't have to mix that many different kits. The biggest crime committed here is obviously the legs. The model looks like he broke both of them in multiple places, and now he's wearing an oversized cast and he has to walk around like that. I don't know where the concept of these giant legs even comes from. Maybe it's because both the iconic artworks I painted viewing him slightly from below. You would hope that Games Workshop is aware of the concept of perspective and things close to you appearing bigger than things further away, but I'm not so sure anymore. Here's the new concept. Oh, big legs, tiny head, got it. While the leg's girth is simply too big, the other proportions like the length of the individual elements is still okay. So I started to simply cut them down, basically carving new legs out of the old ones. I started slimming down the feet until I was happy and then simply took them as a guide for how much I had to cut away from the rest of the legs. First using broad cuts and then slowly fine-tuning the shape by gradually scraping away material with my blades. I tried to come up with something a little more intriguing, similar to the more gothic shape of the legs in the art, so I flattened the shin area, hoping that this would make it look more interesting. Once I was happy with the rough shape of the lower legs, I cut them off so I could later repose them to my liking and proceeded with the upper legs, getting rid of all the ornaments, reducing them to simple cylinders, and trimming them down just like the rest. At this point, I had to make a decision for the pose, and I wanted to base it loosely on this artwork, so I built a small platform for the right foot that is taking a step forward to be slightly elevated. The way these minis assemble leaves them hollow, so I quickly filled the holes with sprue material and then drilled holes so I could add pins. This would help with finding the right pose and keep the final mini more stable. When doing kit bashing, we're basically trying to solve a puzzle. I usually have a goal in mind, and there's many parts that need to be pieced together a certain way to achieve that goal. I just have to find which is the best, but also the most efficient one to get to the desired result. I have the benefit of being a sculptor, and I can replace certain puzzle pieces with pieces I make from scratch. But it's still a lot faster to find a part that fits. The good thing is I didn't have to look too far, because the Stormcast sculpts become a universal solution for most of the things I do in 40k nowadays for some reason. Coteaz is wearing Artificer armor, and this chest plate would be a perfect fit for that, with the detailed pec muscles and rivets. And I know I'm gonna straight up contribute to Nipplegate here, but you will have to deal with that. I cut off all the parts I didn't need from the Stormcast chest and slowly cut down Coteaz's chest until it slotted right in there and felt natural proportion-wise. At that point I felt comfortable to lock in the pose, and since all the elements had holes and pins in it, I could just put everything together like this and fiddle around until I was happy. And a few drops of super glue into the joints fixed it in place. And I know it might not look like much, but this step is a big accomplishment in the process, because now I can focus more on the detailing, filling all the gaps and fleshing out the armor details, like the armor plates and the mechanics of the knee joints, and I widened some parts on the chest plate, mainly because the Stormcast armor is not as chunky as 40k armor. This also made some room for the detail I had to put into the abdominal area to make it closer to the artwork. Creating some armor plates with putty and also fitting in that belt part that wraps under the Inquisitor symbol. I really liked how the lower leg armor turned out in that chunkier style, but the knees had to be tuned down so I could fit the skulls on without going right back to the clumsiness of the original. So after I rounded the knee part, I put down 2 blobs of putty. When I sculpt skulls, I usually follow the same formula, getting the outer shape roughly right, then pressing in eyes with a round tool, getting the hard edges right like around the eye sockets and some initial nose detail, and then adding a hole in the middle with a fine needle, pressing the material up to form the bridge of the nose. I wanted the leg ornaments to look very close to the artworks, something the original Mini completely ditched, which is not a real surprise with the general lack of detail in 40K at the moment. So I put down the general shape of the inquisitorial eye, and I also added the spikes from the art around the skulls. I'm jumping around between different parts of the Mini at this point, but that is mainly due to waiting on the sculpting material to cure. Basically, I'm waiting for the eye shapes on the shins to set, so I can add further detail. Meanwhile, I did add the purity seal that's wrapping around his leg in the art, rolling out a small portion of Magic Sculpt, and adding the roll to the leg before pressing it flat with my color shaper, making it overlap here and there and adding some dents for extra detail. And once the base for my Inquisitor symbols was cured, I added in the last detail still missing. To build the right arm, I looked through my bits box to find a stretched out version, and this leftover piece I had from the Space Marine Captain with Jump Pack was more than perfect. I only had to angle it slightly different and cut off the hand with the chainsaw. Or so I thought. And ultimately, I could have just used any other Space Marine upper arm because I also switched the lower arm for the original. Again, this is a good example for trying to solve the puzzle. Piecing together these existing parts was a lot easier than resculpting the bigger plates on the forearm where the eagle is sitting on. Then once again I pinned everything so I could reposition the elements to find the perfect pose before I glued the arm in place. This process might look tedious, but it has proven the best way to reduce the headache while finding poses. Coincidentally, the hand holding the hammer also had the perfect shape to represent a hand that was releasing an eagle. I just had to liberate it from the blunt force instrument it was holding and get rid of some of the material. Then I glued that shit right on. It's always uplifting to find pieces that are the perfect fit for a problem you're trying to solve. I did consider Stormcast legs initially, but they were too flimsy to replace the original legs. However, they were just right to add detail to the arms. In this case, I used the knee to build the elbow part on the new arm to look closer to the original armor design. I popped a new cap on the back of the hammer and made it a little prettier so I could use it again, having the other hand hold it, and then went on to the next element, which was the cloak. Again, it would be way easier to use this existing part without having to destroy another kit. I just had to make it conform to the new pose better, especially the stretched out arm. I also got rid of the fur on the back because I was just not sure yet if I wanted to add that element in the final result. I popped the cloak back on using a chunk of putty, and when that was cured, I added more and more material to reconstruct the parts I cut away. I was looking at a few heads to find the perfect one, because I wanted to portray my Coteaz a bit closer to the older, white-haired version on the Codex cover art, so I picked a more haggard-looking face. But I didn't want it to look too frail, so I landed on the Space Marine head that I de-Space Marinified a bit before fitting it in. I couldn't find a proper loincloth that would slot into the area and also had a fold structure I liked, so I decided to do one myself. This process usually has 3 stages. First, I roll out the sheet of putty on a glass surface and let it cure a bit so it's more sturdy and doesn't rip when cutting it. Then I cut it in shape, which requires to occasionally fit it to the Mini to see if the size and shape works. The second step is to integrate the sheet with the sculpt, and as I do that, sometimes I realize I need to cut the sheet down further. The next step requires this to have hardened, so meanwhile I dry fitted the other arm and eventually glued it in place. The shoulder guard that came with it was usable, but I customized it a bit. And then I used a small blob of putty to hold it in place. To finish off the loincloth, I added some additional folds, mainly that big one in the front, and that rounds out the 3-step program. Again, I had the option to do the second shoulder guard from scratch, but landed on a Stormcast bit instead, as it turned out to be the perfect fit. I cleaned all the heraldry and rivets, and then just glued it on upside down and filled a few gaps. Like I said, I wanted the hair to be more in the style of the Codex version, so I built the receding hairline first, and then bulked out the rest, with some strands also falling over the armor. Then I started to define the bulk of the hair, before going more and more into detail with finer tools. And after that, I tried to mirror the icon on the right shoulder to the left to draw everything together. I thought about plastering the base with skulls and spikes like in the artwork, but I decided to dial that down and just have a pile of bones that supported the feeling of him stepping up a small slope, and then detailed the rest of the base. Then there was only one thing left to do, mounting the eagle on the arm, and I think it turned out really glorious. Games Workshop just released a new Sanguinary Guard. Definitely a major improvement over the old models. Just look at these majestic wings, the amazing relic weapons, and intricate artificer armor. Poses that show them swooping down from the skies to crush the enemies of the Imperium in the name of the angel himself. Okay, no more jokes. This is a serious topic. What's going on with the design direction in 40k? There has been this weird shift towards tactical, when all I can think of with Space Marines is ancient Gothic armor designs, some of them heralding back to the Horus Heresy and older events. Ridiculously impractical relics as big as a church window on their back, just because they can, and make no mistake, they will still f you up regardless. Giant ancient wings modeled after Sanguinius' very own wings. But instead, we get flaps. The Sanguinary Guard is such an iconic part of 40k lore, and I could not leave them in this miserable state. I wanted to convert them into the intimidating presence on the battlefield they deserve to be. As always, I started to assemble as much of the base model as possible. The monopose approach to most of the new Warhammer minis just leaves you no other choice really before thinking about what you can change. One thing I did right away was to get rid of the base detail, because I knew this was not enough to really make it look like they are soaring over the battlefield, ready to advance and strike. I always found these shin guards really uninspired. The design just didn't look right, so I simply covered up these grooves and sanded everything flat. I prepared for the Blood Angel release by printing some of the Crimson Lord bits that Great Tide Studio just published. I already used their bits back when I wanted to make my Dark Angels more gothic, and they would help me realize the vision I had for these Sanguinary Guard models too. I picked out a shin guard I liked, but quickly realized that I had to cut the armor down a bit to make them fit, maybe because everything is a bit more bulky on these new sculpts. I also needed another element to cover the round parts of the armor on the knee, and these bits, originally intended as bracers I think, fit right in with the pose and the style. I knew it would be hard to mirror this on the second leg, simply because it's posed different, so I just used one of these bits on the knee and skipped the shin detail altogether. Ultimately, I think having one leg more basic is actually fine. I was not super happy with the original arms. It looks like they are flapping around with limbs that are too short, probably because the chest armor is so bulky. But these Great Tide Studio arms open up a lot of possibilities and more dynamic pose options. They also had some amazing pauldrons to choose from. Just compare this assortment I picked to what is on the original models. I like to think these Artificer armors were made to look similar to Sanguinius armor, not some generic tactical bland suit, but a gothic plate laden with ornaments, heraldry and symbols. So I went for this one with the typical orb and blood drop. It's actually kinda crazy how well this fits in my opinion. I chose the second shoulder guard because it looks like it has Sanguinius' face sculpted on, and finalized the pose by using small blobs of clay between the pauldrons and the connectors on the arms. This creates a bit of wiggle room, which helps with making them look a bit more imposing, and it also solves some other posing issues. I was not super happy with the heads in the box. Don't get me wrong, they're not terrible and I will probably use them in some other context. And I also wasn't entirely happy with the ones the Great Tide Studio pack came with. To me, the Sanguinary Guard helmets will always look like this, with the large disc and the two different shapes of spikes radiating outwards. So I dug deep into my bits box and found a couple helmets of the old models, and in my opinion they still hold up great. All three of these look like they are the same model, just copy-pasted and slightly reposed in ZBrush, and I really hated that. Just out of curiosity, I built another one so I could put them next to each other with different wing options, different weapons and details to see how they would look as a group, just more individualized. And I also considered experimenting with a variety of close combat weapons. I know that these are supposed to hold swords or lances, but I just felt the pose would benefit so much more from a power fist. So I thought if two of my other dudes would hold a sword, then proxying one of them with a fist could still work. I said initially that these bases didn't look spectacular enough for me, and they didn't give me the fantasy of flying Space Marines. So instead I grabbed this Great Tide base and pinned the Mini right on top of this pillar. This gave the composition more height and fit the forward movement of the final pose extremely well. Then it was time to consider my wing options. I really don't understand why the new models don't have them anymore. I want to be a fly on the wall during these decision-making processes. How do you go from giant wings on the back to let's just put teeny tiny wings on these flaps here? Like, did someone actually say, nah, it'll be fine, no one will notice? Of course, I still had the wings from the old models, but I actually like the new jump packs better. I also considered using the Great Tide Studio wings, so I put them on the second Mini I assembled. But deep down in my heart I knew that there was only one real option for this. To be able to use the Prosecutor wings and the new jump packs, I had to fiddle around a bit. Of course, I cut off the silly flaps, but I also made the balls of the exhaust ones smaller so I could fit the jet engine type parts on there. This would look like the propelling jets were mounted on a ball joint so they could actually move and you'd be able to use them to navigate. And I could just mount the wings on the side of the jump pack where I simply got rid of the rest of the sculpt. After gluing the jets to the ball joints, I cut the wings down to where only the hinges were left over. Originally, I thought about just keeping the mechanical parts and wanted to cut off the energy-like extensions, so it would just be the feathers showing, and I think this could still work, but by keeping the extensions, everything would just look so much more majestic, so I went with it and pinned everything together. Ooh. That's crazy. It's looking so much better. Now it was time to paint this bad boy, and because a lot of you have asked me how to paint Grimdark Custodes or Grimdark Gold armor in general, the idea was to paint him in my Grimdark Space Marines approach. Recently I experimented a bit with different Rattle primers and I found Color Forge to work really well for me. The result is relatively matte, smooth and not grainy at all. They also have a ton of different color options. I'll put a link to them in the description if you want to check them out. I used their Hyrax base as a base color because, as you know, brown works really well in my Grimdark approach for a lot of different colors. I dug deep into my stash of metallic paints and found that Necro Gold by Scale 75 would fit my idea really well. And I started sponging this paint all over the model. I did not leave out any particular areas like I usually do in my other Grimdark videos. Instead, I tried to create a base that looked gold but at the same time had a lot of brown still visible, so it would look really ancient and discolored as well as being exposed to physical impacts all the time. I was not sure yet what I would do with the the feathers, so I also covered most of the wings the same way, and back here you can see the texture really well. As usual, I switched to small sponge pieces and a flayed brush to reach all the areas I could not properly get to with the large sponge, and then built an initial highlight step with my new favorite color, Tainted Gold by Army Painter. You can see that I switched to a more precise brush now, and I focused more on edges and general parts that I wanted to have a specular highlight. You could still do this with a sponge, but I honestly feel like the precision loss does not really justify the minuscule amount of time you will save. Oh, and I'm not treating this like a regular highlight step where you would try to paint within the borders of the first gold layer. Even if I hit some of the brown with this highlight, we still keep the most important aspect, which is the texture. After this step, we arrive at a very desaturated gold. So right now I'm trying to bring back some saturation, but also start adding a variety of discolorations. This first color is burnt sienna ink, and it adds a reddish quality to the gold as well as some shading. You can see that I actively keep pushing the pigment towards the lower area of the features. In the areas where I thought I lost too much of the shine, I dabbed on a bit of bright gold by Army Painter to bring it back, and also to add more yellow to the gold again. Next up, I mixed Incubi Darkness with a bit of burnt umber. This color built some great turquoise discolorations that work extremely well with copper colors and dark golds. But I'm not slapping this on all of the mini. I rather focus on particular areas like the feet and some parts of the pauldrons. And I also added to one area of the helmet. You could think of it as corrosion, and I get that some might say gold doesn't corrode, but in my head, these armors are so old, even myriads of servitors can only do so much to clean and repair the exposure to weather, physical blows, tyrannid blood, acid or chemical weapons. And sure, you could replace parts of the armor, but these are sacred husks, relics of old, blessed by the angel himself. You don't simply cut pieces of it out and replace them. Then I'm gradually adding emerald to the base color, and I'm covering less space, focusing more and more on the recesses. And for the last layer, I used this verdigris color simply because it's a great premixed tone. You could just add white to the emerald instead, and I touch up these very recesses with it until I'm happy with the result. Once I was happy with the armor, I touched up all the gemstones with black and built some red main color back up, especially in this orb on the shoulder, moving into brighter reds and oranges, eventually painting the black drop of blood and putting an outline around it, followed by some bright reflections with gray and finally white at the top. If any of this is too fast and you would like to see more and longer tutorials for these steps that follow, you can join my Patreon at the video level supporter, and I will put them there in the next few days. I wanted the loincloth to be reminiscent of Sanguinius too, so instead of painting it like cloth, I went for a piece of fur. My base color was tall and ochre, mixed with black, and then washed over it with a skin color to add variety. Then I gradually added some ice yellow to the base mix and built brighter layers, using mostly lines, so I could build the illusion of fur even more. For the last highlight I used ivory, and then I added black lines to build the spot pattern. I gave the feathers on the backpack a splotchy layer of medium sea gray by AK Interactive, and gave them a layer of thin down umber and some dark turquoise I still had on my palette to make them look old as well, and then built an initial layer of white where the feathers met the energy extensions. Then I built a gradient from white to the black of the tips using my airbrush. I'm trying not to go too fast here so I don't have any speckling hit the gold parts, and so my gradients are smooth. Once I was done with the black and the white gradient, I used a 1:5 mix of Thalasar blue and Aethematic blue contrast paint, and I layered it right on top of the gradient. To keep everything coherent and not to introduce too many new colors, I wanted the sword to be a similar color, and also built the gradient on it with the airbrush, using a piece of masking tape to shield the other side of the blade each time. Then I added an edge highlight with pure white, and also freehanded a lightning pattern of crackling energy on top of the gradient, followed by a few layers of my contrast mix. After that, I only had to pick out some spots of the lightning with a very bright blue mix, and the sword was done. I wasn't really happy with the glow effect on the wings yet, so I went back to it, letting thin down white oil paint run into all the recesses. And wherever it hit a surface it wasn't supposed to be on, I got rid of the paint again with a sponge. The final result looks like the glow from the energy is bleeding out from under the feathers, and I quite like how it turned out. At this point I wanted to go all out and added a light effect on jet exhausts and also the intakes. And then also gave the plasma rifle a glowing heat effect. And now for the final reveal.
I kinda wish Games Workshop would take 40k into a more gothic direction again. At least away from the tactical flair everything has right now, because I'm getting really tired of having to fix all of these minis for them. But hey, if it keeps Great Tide Studios in business, I'm fine with that. Their bits really played a major role in this conversion turning out as awesome as it did. Let me know how you like the direction I took for this one, and consider checking out the more in-depth videos on Patreon. If you join, you do get access to more than 200 additional videos and PDF guides. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and see you in the next one.